Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're joining us from. Today, we're going to be covering the topic of organic food fraud within the context of strengthening organic enforcement, which is the new updates to the NOP regulations. So really what we're focused on is how to ensure that your organic food fraud plan is going to be compliant with those new regulations. So before we get started, there's just a few logistics I'd like to cover here. First, everybody's going to be in listen-only mode. We do have a lot of attendees today. So if you have any comments or questions, we'll invite you to put those into the chat. If you cannot hear us or if you're having a hard time seeing the screen, just feel free to drop that into the chat. We will have a Q&A at the end here for about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the presentation. So in your control panel, you should see a menu that you can open for questions. We will be monitoring that and trying to get to as many questions as we can. As there are so many attendees, we might not be able to get to every single question. So we will be trying to highlight the questions that I think the entire audience would benefit from. But do rest assured, if your questions are not answered during the presentation today, we will follow up with you and make sure that everybody gets a response to their questions. This webinar is also being recorded, so we will be emailing all of the attendees recording of the webinar tomorrow. So we are your presenters. I'm Brandon Nauman. I'm the technical director of our organic certification program. I have a background in organic farming and auditing. And my colleague here is Denise Webster, our VP of Food Safety, Training, and Consulting. So it's been my job in the auditing role to tell you what you cannot do. Denise is incredibly helpful. She is in consulting and can tell you what to do. So we're going to tag team this presentation today, and we'll go ahead and dive in. So we'll start with a little background on SCS Global Services. I know many in the audience are already familiar with our organization, however, many may not be. We're an international leader in third-party food safety, environmental, and sustainability certification, as well as standards development. We specialize in auditing, certification, verification, training services, life cycle assessment, and consulting. And the organic program, which is where I reside, is one of many of our service offerings within the food and ag space. SCS was among the very first certifying bodies accredited under the USDA's National Organic Program. And organic is currently one of our fastest growing program areas. We have clients in most of the US states, Mexico, and across Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, as well as Western and Central Asia. And these are the topics that we're going to highlight today. I'll begin by covering some of the key outcomes of the National Organic Program's Strengthening Organic Enforcement initiative, which includes a requirement that all certified organic operations maintain an organic fraud prevention plan. So we'll dig into that a bit, including what should be included in the fraud prevention plan. And then I'll pass it over to Denise, who has many years of experience in consulting and supporting clients with fraud avoidance. So Denise will define organic fraud, get into some of the background and some of the psychology associated with committing fraud, and will help you better understand really what to be thinking about, what to be looking for when considering your fraud risk. And then Denise will walk you through how to conduct an effective vulnerability assessment of your own operation and your supply chain to support you in developing an effective fraud prevention plan and how to best mitigate your fraud risk. And then again, at the end, we will have some time for Q&A. So we absolutely invite your questions. You can ask them as they come up. However, with so many attendees, if you're too quick, they might start to get kind of buried up the thread a little bit. So it might benefit you to kind of hold off until towards the end of the session. So before we get into the technical material here, we have a quick poll just to see who in the audience is familiar with fraud, who has a fraud prevention plan and what type. So I'd invite everybody that can here to respond to this poll. and identify if you have a fraud prevention plan in place, either for GFSI compliance for the Good Food Safety Initiative, for GMP audit compliance, for organic compliance, or, as I'm sure many of you are in this boat, no, I have not yet completed a fraud prevention plan. So we'll give you maybe 20, 30 seconds here to respond, and then we can take a look at the results.
All right, we've closed the poll. I'll now share the results.
All right, and so it looks like most of you that do have a fraud prevention plan, it has been for GFSI compliance. That's great. Some for GMP audit compliance and some for organic compliance. So you're already a little bit ahead of the game here. So I think you'll still be able to take away from the topics that we cover today ways that you can really evaluate the effectiveness of your fraud prevention plan and continue to improve upon it. And it looks like the minority actually responded that, no, I don't have a fraud prevention plan in place. So that's great. Many of you are already familiar with what it means to detect and deter fraud. But I think that you'll be able to walk away from today's presentation more capable of continuous improvement of that fraud prevention plan. All right, so let's kick it off by talking about strengthening organic enforcement, otherwise known as SOE. This is something that everybody should be familiar with by now. If not, don't worry, we'll kind of give you the highlights here. And so basically SOE amounts to the greatest change to the organic regulations since the creation of the National Organic Program over 20 years ago. The rule is really intended to close gaps in the current regulations and build consistent certification practices to detect and prevent fraud, specifically organic fraud in this case. To improve the transparency and traceability of organic products in the supply chain, and to protect organic integrity to support the continued growth of the organic market and trust in the USDA organic seal. So the rule was published in the winter of 2023 and went into effect just over a month ago on March 19th of 2024. So we're about 5 weeks in now. Each of the updates to the regulations targets a specific vulnerability, which is a term that you're going to hear a lot today, or weakness in the existing regulations. One of the most significant updates was to reduce the number of exemptions from certification. So previously it was not required that many operations that are in the middle of the supply chain had to be certified, and that's no longer the case. So we'll get into that a little bit here in a few minutes. NOP has also improved the labeling requirements for non-retail products to improve how they're identified and how they can be traced through the supply chain. We've increased the minimum qualifications and training requirements for inspectors and certification personnel to ensure that we're all up to speed on the scopes that we're auditing to and have the tools that we need to support fraud prevention. In other words, the ability to detect and deter and report fraud. Further, USDA has made organic certificates more fraud proof. They're all being issued out of a system now that is run by USDA. They've clarified the requirements for traceability and mass balance audits during inspection. This has always been a best practice and a common practice during inspection. However, they've just clarified that traceability and mass balance audits are now required. They're also requiring that organic certifiers, such as SCS, are conducting risk-based supply chain audits. So oftentimes that will be done in cooperation with other certifying agents so that we can really look at entire supply chains so that we can detect and take action against organic fraud. And finally, and probably most relevant to the topic at hand today, is the requirement that certified operations must maintain and implement an organic fraud prevention plan. So, why all these changes? Well, I mean, really what we're looking to do here is improve trust in the organic label. So everything really leads to improving trust. And the kinds of things that erode trust are organic fraud or bad actors within the supply chain. All of these things erode consumer confidence. They have really knock-on effects downstream in supply chains. So we're adding rigor at all levels of the organic supply chain. This facilitates market access for operators. It ensures equity among certified operations and really serves as a deterrent for bad actors. We want to identify them, we want to get them out so that everybody else can proceed to maintain their reputational, minimize their reputational risk and maintain that trust in the organic label. So some of the highlights here of strengthening organic enforcement, as I indicated, are limiting exemptions from certification. So among the limited exemptions now are some retail operations, grocery stores, for example, particularly ones that don't process organic products and distribute them to other outlets. Distribution of retail products remains an exempt activity, and storage of sealed organic product. Traceability, again, now at every inspection, every operator should expect that you are going to undergo a mass balance audit where we're looking at the flow of products through your operation over time, traceability to the last certified operation, and that certifiers are conducting these risk-based supply chain audits. And then finally, organic fraud prevention plan. That's where we're going to spend most of our time today, really helping you understand what it looks like to observe your entire supply chain, to identify critical control points as part of your vulnerability assessment, and what mitigation measures are going to be appropriate to minimize that risk of fraud, to deter it, detect it, and report it. So we'll get into each of these topics in a little bit more detail, starting with limiting exemptions from certification. So prior to the implementation of strengthening organic enforcement, there were two categories of operations that did not require certification. Some were called exclusions and some were called exemptions. NOP has done away with the term exclusions. Most of those exclusions have been eliminated. The remaining ones have just been rolled into one category. Anyone that is now not necessarily required to be certified is considered exempt. So that's the terminology they're using now. So these exemptions are much, much more limited than they were prior to March 19th. So some retail operations, those would be operations that either don't do any processing on site, or operations, grocery stores, for example, that might have an organic deli counter and they're making sandwiches out of organic products, or they're making prepared foods to sell on site out of organic products, provided that those items are sold only where they're processed or prepared. Those types of retail operations remain exempt. Distribution of retail product. So this would be your large distributors, your KHEs, your UNFIs, for example, that are largely supplying grocery stores. And this exemption only applies to distribution of product that is sealed in tamper-evident retail packaging. So really anybody that's in the middle of the supply chain or not providing a finished retail product, a product labeled for retail sale, that a customer would purchase and take home with them to consume. Everyone else that is involved in the distribution of organic products, whether it's food service or middle of the supply chain, largely supplying downstream handlers and processors, now require certification. Storage-only facilities that do not buy or sell or otherwise handle organic product, but the product just lands there, they don't take ownership of it, and then it's shipped out. It remains in sealed, tamper-evident packaging. Those types of warehousing operations remain exempt, as do transportation companies, customs and logistics brokers, and so forth. Really, the prior exemptions that now require certification that are maybe the most significant here are the buying and selling of non-retail products. So this, again, is your middle of the supply chain distributors and handlers, as well as any operation that is importing or exporting organic products. And that applies even to the import and export of retail products. So if you're involved in international trade, that is an automatic trigger now for requiring organic certification. Improvement of supply chain traceability requirements. So during your organic inspection, it's a requirement that your inspector is going to do a traceability audit. And what we're looking for is that you're able to trace one step back to the last certified handler and then one step forward to your customer. And if every certifier of every operation along the supply chain is doing that, then there is visibility into these supply chains, complete visibility into these supply chains. So a traceback audit is a traceability exercise that examines the audit trail for organic products back to the last certified handler. So for example, you'd start with one lot of finished product, follow it backwards through the entire chain of handlers and the records that are associated with the movements of that product, using unique identifiers such as lot numbers, production dates, purchase orders, sales orders, and so forth. For a traceback audit to be successful, you need to provide the inspector with all of the documents and records relevant to the lot of that product that is being traced and track all of the movements of that product back through the supply chain to the last certified handler. So really we're looking at, can you demonstrate that the shipment of that product originated at an address that is on your supplier's organic certificate? During a mass balance audit, this is more of a time-bound audit. So what we're looking at is the product that you have received and sold over time. So the outcome here is to ensure that a sufficient quantity of organic ingredients has been sourced to support the amount that has been produced, shipped, or sold to your customers. So this focuses on the product that was received and shipped within a defined period of time. So really the purpose here is to verify that you did not produce or sell more organic product than what you had available. For example, an operation produces 1,000 pounds of organic bread, requiring 800 pounds of organic flour, but only receive 500 pounds of organic flour. So that would be a shortcoming of, or a shortfall of 300 pounds of organic flour. So that operation would have some questions to answer for sure. Inspectors using traceability techniques really play an important role in detecting either negligent or fraudulent activities that could jeopardize organic integrity. They use a situational crime prevention approach. And let's kind of think about that for a minute. Fraud is crime. You know, the USDA organic standards are actually one of the only third-party standards that is written into the US government's federal law. This is in the Code of Federal Regulations. And USDA takes organic fraud very seriously. And when they find that your operation is complicit in fraud, is willfully perpetrating fraud, they're pursuing really heavy civil penalties. I've seen in recent months civil penalties well in excess of $50,000 for fraudulent actors. So this is something that everybody in the audience should really take seriously, and again, really understand that fraud is crime and the regulators are handling it as such. So this approach seeks to modify situational factors to further limit opportunities for fraudulent or criminal behavior. So now we're going to move on to learning a little bit more about the fraud prevention plan, what it should include, and how you should be approaching the development of your organic fraud prevention plan. So maintaining a fraud prevention plan is now a requirement under the NOP regulations. Specifically, The organic system plan must include a description of the monitoring practices and procedures to verify suppliers in their supply chain and organic status of agricultural products that are received, and to prevent organic fraud as appropriate to the certified operations activities, scope, and complexity. So that was lifted straight from the Code of Federal Regulations. GFSI plans are a really good starting point here. So most of you responded to the poll that you do have a fraud prevention plan in place for your GFSI audit. That's outstanding. We're not trying to recreate the wheel here, but help you understand how you can further build out that plan to address organic compliance and specifically organic fraud. And so this applies to raw materials that you receive, store, and process, and the packing and shipment of finished organic products. So what I just read was straight from the Code of Federal Regulations, what an organic fraud prevention plan basically is. But to meet these requirements and to maintain procedures to prevent fraud, really, what does that look like? How do I get started? Well, a complete and effective, emphasis on effective plan should include these elements here. So a map of your operations supply chain. And this is an exercise that maybe many of you have not actually done, to sit down and really diagram your supply chain. And in doing so, it might surprise you the things that start coming to mind, the critical control points that you can start to identify by undergoing that exercise. Without doing that and just kind of sitting here in isolation, thinking about where fraud might occur, some things that might not come to mind otherwise may if you're actually sitting down and diagramming your supply chain. So the whole point of that, again, is to identify your critical control points. Those would be points at which there is an opportunity for organic fraud, which Denise is going to cover here in a little bit. And to really conduct a complete vulnerability assessment. And that is intended to identify potential weaknesses within your supply chain or areas where fraud might arise. So that vulnerability assessment will really help you have confidence that you've done a good job in identifying your critical control points. For each of those control points, then we're going to be looking at implementation of mitigation measures. Here's a risk. What can we do about it? What steps can we take proactively as opposed to reactively to minimize the threat for organic fraud? And then when it does occur or when fraud is suspected, how can you then react? What steps can you take to mitigate that, to respond to it, and then to report it to your certifier, to USDA, to other interested parties here that might have a stake in the matter or be adversely affected by that fraud. And I'm going to pass it over to Denise now to provide definitions for organic fraud, food fraud, and really walk you through how to conduct your vulnerability assessment.
Thank you, Brandon. And one of the things that he mentioned was we think about food fraud as part of our existing GFSI third-party food safety audits. And so I thought it would be helpful if we compared and contrast those two definitions so we can see that, as Brandon pointed out, they likely would not fully meet these new requirements as it exists in the OFPP or in the NOP. So by GFSI definition, food fraud is that deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation of food, packaging, label, claims, or other statements for economic gain. Now, when we look at the NOP definition for organic food fraud, it is specific to that deception, representation, sale, or labeling of non-organic agricultural products or ingredients as those three certified claims: 100% organic and made with organic. So when we look at this from an example standpoint, we really have to look at history, what's happening. And according to research and past incidents, produce and other raw agricultural products and ingredients are at the highest risk for organic food fraud. And have we, as part of our existing food safety food fraud programs, have we really looked at that organic component? And we'll also talk about that supply chain and how important that transparency or reverse loss of that supply chain control could result in organic food fraud. Additionally, those fraudulent certificates and claims. In 2020, there was a $12 million shipment of organic raspberries that actually was intercepted because it came in with fake certifications. So this does exist. These are issues that we have to consider, again, to build that trust around that organic claim and logo in the industry. So how do we do this? We can take some of those fundamental building blocks that for success that we already have in our systems, which is making sure we have that senior management commitment and resources. How do we do that? Well, we need to make sure senior management is aware of these new NOP regulations and the SOE. Let them know what is going on, what we need to do differently. Don't just do the magic behind the scenes, because at the end of the day, they may need to provide you additional resources and commitment to be able to ensure that you can indeed prevent food fraud in your chain of your control of the supply. As well as it might be helpful to identify a cross-functional or multidisciplinary team of both internal or even external support to really be able to understand where those risks are and to discuss how that might impact your organization. Training, of course, is always a key element to ensure that we have qualified team members, they understand the risk of food fraud, but also if they have those activities assigned through the mitigation strategy, that they're qualified to perform those. And ultimately, ensuring effective communication in and throughout the organization about the specifics to organic risk. So what considerations should we have? Well, we really can look at the fact that fraud can occur anywhere in the supply chain. And it's really important to understand that there are underlying weaknesses and vulnerabilities in both the external and internal system. We primarily gravitate to thinking about it from an external standpoint. What's the history of that product or supply? Have there been incidents in the past? How complex is the supply chain? Like berry industry, right? There's hundreds of farms that could go into one shipment of berries out into distribution. Premium price, that can also be a factor that we'll talk about when we're looking at the vulnerability assessment. Supply and demand, we have seen an unprecedented 50% fold since 2020 of organic purchase. People are looking for more organic product, but there's a lot of time that it takes to convert a farm or a field to properly follow those organic regulations and be certified. So there's that kind of risk factor. Also, there is the weather or geopolitical issues that can occur that can impact the supply and demand of the organic market. And those certificates that we talked about that could be fraudulent. Now, on the flip side, we also have internal fraud that we might not necessarily think about, and we might have not actually put in our current food fraud plans. We need to look at what's going on in our own, four walls. Do we have the risk of potential, our composition of ingredients and formulas? Do we have organic ingredients that potentially you also have a non-organic ingredient in your operation? And there could be that risk of grabbing the wrong one, perhaps poor employee training or policies or procedures. That's why we do those mass balance and make sure that indeed we're using the organic ingredients. There also might be COGS pressure to use the ingredient that isn't organic because we're trying to lower our price or cost. So that is really an internal fraud component risk as well. And do we have the appropriate validation and verification activities? We're validating those certificates that are coming in, but also verifying that we're internally maintaining that whole supply chain and the protection of that organic ingredient, such as use of pesticides and percentage in the product. That also falls in line with audit results. So the key is that this is all about that motivation to create economic gain. Although there could be impacts on food safety, quality, even food defense, really with fraud, we're talking about that motivation of economic gain. So how do we start this process? Well, we're using that term critical control points, right, in a different light. This is built into the NOP regulations. So, we have the basis of knowledge of how to develop a flow chart, make sure we have diagrams, but this is a little more complex, and I'll show you a picture of it here in just a few slides. We need a supply chain mapping exercise, and you may have not ever conducted that past your four walls. We need to look at that entire supply chain of that organic ingredient coming in and identify those potential risks through that vulnerability assessment. Once we do that, we then determine if there are CCPs, and we'll look at some of these as an option. So what does CCP mean in this lens? Well, it means a specific stage in the process or supply chain where a control measure is necessary to prevent, eliminate, or reduce the risk of organic food fraud. I'm sure that sounds familiar to our food safety folks here on the call around CCPs. But with this focus is going to be about the risk of food fraud. So think about that supply chain mapping and some of this vulnerability assessment that we're going to share with you here briefly as kind of that pre-screen or that hazard analysis to determine whether or not we do have any CCPs in our supply chain that, of course, then would need mitigation strategies in place. We want to identify that product process flow and supply chain where organic integrity of the product could be compromised. So here we have just a general image of the complexity of a raw agricultural product like flour, right? We have multiple farms, multiple storage, or maybe one consolidated bulk storage. We then pass that to the grain processor, flour miller. We then maybe have an additional even step of further refinement, pack off into those flour bags. We might also have bulk shipment of flour. And we can go further to this, ultimately to that bakery, that organic bakery that's going to use this, which may be your bakery. So we can see the complexity of this supply chain. So where are the CCPs in the supply chain? Where should we be focusing our effort, as Brandon mentioned, proactively instead of reactively? That we're not just having trust, right? But we're validating and verifying that indeed the supply chain controls are in place, or we need to make sure that we put a higher level CCP in place to ensure we can prove that yes, our controls are going to meet that organic food fraud prevention plan. So what do you need to do? Well, unfortunately, you do have to think like a criminal. What is their motivation? Well, we do know that motivation is a key component of food fraud because of that economic gain. But actually, many researchers and industry professionals have kind of come together and have come up with the food fraud triangle. And really, there's three components coming together almost like a Venn diagram, or yes, 3 points like a triangle. So there's that motivation, that financial pressure or reward, right? So that motivation could be I'm not meeting my COGS numbers, I need to do something nefarious, or I'm going to do this on purpose, I'm going to willingly break the law in order to be able to get more revenue. There's also, it's not just flanked with motivation, there has to be an opportunity. There needs to be an opportunity to be able to commit that fraud. We need to be able to protect that opportunity by eliminating or reducing that. So even if the motivation is there, the opportunity isn't. And lastly, it's that rationalization or the justification for committing food fraud. We've got the motivation and the opportunity, and then we've rationalized it. Right? We're willing to cheat people. We're knowledgeable about the risk, and we still choose to do it. We've rationalized that, oh, that's organic. Nobody's going to get hurt, right? It's attractive to them, right? Coming together to create that unfortunate vulnerability or weakness in the operation, and why it's so important, and the reason why the SOE has really, worked to strengthen these programs. But ultimately, how do we respond? Well, we do have to think proactively through prevention. This is not, a mechanism to try to eliminate it, where we can, obviously, but it is really about prevention, and we can reduce the vulnerability where we have those controls in our own supply chain. So how do we go about this process? Well, we have to conduct that vulnerability assessment. So we're doing that supply chain mapping, right? So we have all the components, we know what we're looking for, we know what raw materials, ingredients, who we're buying things from. Now we have to overlay that through a systematic evaluation that identifies those weaknesses and susceptibility in the system, in those processes or organization. And remember, we're also factoring that internal food fraud. And then ultimately, that vulnerability assessment will help us develop prevention and mitigation strategies. It's also known as VASIP. You might have heard that in the industry. That's a kind of like a HACCP coined, but it's with that vulnerability assessment with a combination of that food fraud prevention assessment, the prevention strategy, and the management system. So this is all coming together, where the vulnerability assessment is a portion of that, and the output is if we identify any CCPs, and then of course the management system that must go along with that. Okay, so if we look at it from just a vulnerability standpoint, how do we go about determining those vulnerabilities when we're looking at each point in our supply chain, as well as specific to that particular product that you are bringing in as organic? So there are many factors, but some of these are the key ones that you want to make sure you're including, which is the inherent risk of that ingredient, like berries, for example, or soybeans, where we might have that even bioengineered product being at risk of contaminating our organic product stream, as well as that market price that we talked about, composition, its physical state. Is there the way it's made? Can it be kind of downgraded? Is there a process that can reduce its inherent or increase its inherent risk? And all of these kind of the ability to be a factor in your vulnerability assessment. And I'll share with you a few charts here in just a few minutes. Business pressures, like we talked about, price fluctuations, supply and demand, economic, and those geopolitical issues. So when there's war or unrest in certain areas, and that is a region that has a high input of that organic ingredient, then of course that does raise the eyebrow, and we need to be able to get ahead of that by looking at it from our vulnerability risk factor, as well as controls of the buyer. We need to be knowledgeable about the supply chain. We talked about that transparency and traceability. Without those two things, we really are not able to understand the vulnerability. So we need to be knowledgeable. So where can you get this information? Well, there are databases out there, both paid and free. There's horizon scanning tools, and there's just Google searches. Some of the key ones that I would point out is looking for warning letters, import alerts, recalls, notification, right? That's public information, free of charge. Just go to the websites, and I'll share at the end of this, or Brandon will share at the end of this, are resources that you guys can go to as well. And those free or paid food fraud databases. University, many of you probably have heard of Dr. Spink at Michigan State University. He has been paramount in making sure the industry is knowledgeable about VASIP. and has a website where you can get more information as well. And international newsletters. There's quite a bit of newsletters that you can get a horizon scan of what's going on globally, as well as scientific journals and peer-reviewed articles where they've physically looked at the level of contamination or lack of organic control within the organic supply chain when it comes specifically to it being fraudulent. So what tools do you use? We know we've got all these factors to consider. Just like our food safety plan, we will look at the biological, chemical, and physical hazards and run it through a significance chart. You can do the same thing with your food fraud vulnerability, but of course, we're not looking at food safety, we're looking at that risk of organic fraudulent activities and all those different factors. So this chart, you guys are probably very familiar with. It's just the severity times the likelihood to determine significance. When we look at what we're evaluating, we're putting it through the verbiage of, is it insignificant risk of organic fraud or is it an extreme risk? Again, based on history and all those vulnerabilities that we just talked about. And what's the likelihood? The likelihood at that particular point in the supply chain. So don't forget that we're not just looking at this from a raw material standpoint, we have to look at it from where it's at in the supply chain. And I have to admit that was one of the first things I had to learn because I've been doing GFSI-based food fraud assessments for a long time. But the organic is slightly different because we have to look at that supply chain and that point in the supply chain. We're not just looking at the actual ingredient risk itself. So that's one option. Here's example 2. So there's no specific approved method in the NOP that you have to use. These are some options to provide you guys a head start. This one I like because we don't just look at it from a likelihood and severity, but we overlay that profitability, right? That motivation of economic gain. You could even use the food fraud triangle risk too to look at those opportunities as well and add that to your chart. So here we can see the level of profitability, the higher cost of a product, the increase that it can be. So for example, maybe it's organic vanilla. We already know vanilla bean is expensive. Or something of the nature that maybe is very ubiquitous and you can find organic everywhere and it's low cost, then that's going to lower your risk. So here we can look at this chart as just one example to address all those key elements and ultimately come up with an outcome. Are you at risk for vulnerability for that product, for that point in the supply chain? So you do need to make sure that it's not just looking at the vulnerability, but we have that outcome ranking. What does it mean? So here I took our first chart and overlaid those category risk outcomes and then built what that would mean for the business. So if I were to tag that particular vulnerability as high, then I am going to dictate that it's going to require 2 or more prevention plans. So you could take that approach. Maybe it's very high and we need at least have 1 essential CCP or prevention plan in our monitoring and verification activities. This again is just an example to help you figure out with that multidisciplinary team and support by senior management to look at the vulnerability of the supply chain and ensure that we do put prevention procedures in place and identify those CCPs. This has to be documented. Records in place have to be part of this overall program. We can't just decide together and move forward. We have to show to the auditor that we've done this assessment, we've identified where, if any, CCPs do exist in our supply chain and how we got there. So another piece of that puzzle is making sure we have our mitigation plan, that ability to reduce the consequences of that event. So again, we're focused on prevention, right? We're not able to effectively probably eliminate it entirely. So it's prevention over being reactive. And with these mitigation strategies, we would put those in place for, at minimum, at least the CCPs that you've identified. And you can see in this chart that our mitigation strategies for the receiving step of our organic whole soybeans, that we have multiple things in place. We're going to use only approved suppliers. We're going to ensure there's no history of the issue. We're going to verify their NOP certificate, and we'll show you that ability to verify here in the next slide. And that all of our documents and records indicate organic. This is just to get you started. And then how are you going to continually monitor? So here we're going to have an annual supplier review. Maybe we're going to test. We're going to check, you know, every third lot or every lot maybe, you know, whether or not it isn't bioengineered soybeans mixed in, or it's, you know, we might look at pesticide. There are certain things that you can test, but it's not a requirement by the NLP regulations to test. That's just an option you may choose. Now, on the flip side, if we have bulk transport shipments here, what's the risk? Well, cleaning, right? We have bulk shipments, so we need to make sure that we're verifying cleaning protocols and that they're not transferring that product through an uncertified or unapproved transport. Hence, why that SOE is strengthening that supply chain, because now we're looking at that non-retail product supply chain as well. And here you could ensure that your monitoring activities is a clean truck affidavit, record review, and anything else in that monitoring that would help us ensure food fraud prevention strategies are effective and verified. But don't forget to consider that internal risk, right? These are kind of incoming, but you do want to make sure that you have evaluation of the vulnerability of all the internal risk, and you might have a CCP that exists in your own operation to make sure, for example, your team doesn't grab the wrong product, especially if you bring in a product that is both organic and non-organic. Okay, so I'll pass it over to Brandon to talk about some of the resources that are available to you guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Denise. And I really like that you touched on the internal component as well. As everyone should consider that fraud isn't always something that happens to you, but something that, given that fraud triangle, could happen within your own organization too. So that is one thing that I want to make sure is not lost on the audience here. And thanks for covering that, Denise. I'm going to fly through these resources here, guys, because there are some great questions coming in, and I want to answer as many of these as possible. One of the best tools that is at your disposal is public facing here. Anybody can access it, and it's the USDA Organic Integrity Database. Put that right into Google. It's the first thing that's going to come up. And you can look up any entity here and see if they're certified, see if they're suspended, revoked, if they've surrendered their certification. So this is what the homepage looks like. And I would encourage, if you're accessing this resource, to use the advanced search function. And that will bring up a menu bar where you can select the option to not only view active certifications, but also if an operation has been suspended, had their certification revoked, or if they've surrendered their certification. Those aren't going to come up if you just use the basic search tool, but I encourage everyone, if you're going to use this resource, which I absolutely do encourage, to use that advanced search functionality so that you can also search to say, you know, to determine, is this supplier facing sanctions? Have they been suspended? Have they had their certification revoked? And then the Organic Trade Association has a wonderful fraud prevention guide. This is for members of Organic Trade Association. Anybody that is, I encourage everybody to become an OTA member, quite frankly, because they give wonderful resources that are at your disposal that can be operationalized. And they have an incredibly detailed step-by-step approach for how to develop a really good fraud prevention plan and how to identify and deter fraud. within your supply chain. And USDA themselves, they put out a wonderful, wonderful series of trainings here. So kind of in tandem with the Organic Integrity Database, which I covered 2 slides ago, they also have the Organic Integrity Learning Center. This is not only for certifiers, but also for certified operations or anybody that's interested in this. You can register for a free account, and they have dozens and dozens of incredibly detailed trainings in there on a range of topics. One, just like how to get started with certification, but they have a whole series on fraud prevention as well. So the Organic Integrity Learning Center can be a huge, huge benefit to you in helping identify what steps you can take to strengthen your fraud prevention plan. And again, all of this is free and accessible to the public. And USDA also maintains a database of fraudulent organic certificates. So if you don't really know your supplier very well, or if you have a little bit of suspicion or reason to question what they're providing to you, this is a place that you can start as well. Use this in tandem with the Organic Integrity Database to see if this operation has been flagged for a fraudulent certificate. So really what we hope that you take home with you today is the ability to consider whether your fraud prevention plan hits the mark. Not only should it meet the minimum bar as written in the regulations and satisfy your organic certification body, but it should be effective, right? Why are we doing this in the first place? It's to minimize the risk to your operation and to protect your business and the integrity of the product that you're transacting. So if you can confidently say that your organic fraud prevention plan contains these elements, then you're well on your way to being able to detect, deter, and effectively manage your fraud risk. Now, keep in mind, again, that your fraud prevention plan is not just something that should be considered one and done. It should be maintained, evaluated, and improved upon regularly once it's operationalized. Once you start putting this into action, you're going to find ways to look a little bit deeper in your supply chains or even your internal risk of fraud and learning about how you can best identify those risks and mitigate them. So the bottom line here is that if you have a risk-aware mindset, you're going to be more prepared to combat organic fraud. So to highlight some of the other services that SCS offers here, we've talked a lot about organic, but this is a range of services that we offer within the food and ag space, from product claims, non-GMO project verified, regenerative organic, fair trade, gluten-free, plant-based. We also offer your entire range of GFSI food safety audits, BRCGS, SQF, Global Gap, Primus GFS, and many, many more programs. So I encourage everybody to go to the SCS website so that you can really see the range of services that we offer. And what you're taking home with you today doesn't necessarily only apply to organic, but fraud can occur within any of these programs, and you can deploy the same approach for developing an effective fraud prevention plan. And then on the consulting side, maybe you have an understanding of where you are, but need a little bit of support just getting it over the finish line, or really want that validation that what you have developed is robust and is effective. Or maybe your head's just spinning and you need help finding that starting point. We can help you with this. Denise and her team are wonderful and incredibly experienced at this and can really help you put pen to paper and develop your fraud prevention plan. Again, not only for organic, but for food safety, preparing for your non-GMO project audit, responsible sourcing, ESG reporting, climate and carbon. There's really almost nowhere in the industry that we're not involved here in some way. So again, check in on our website, drop us a line, and we'll be happy to help get you started. And finally, we do have some time here for Q&A. I know that we're up against our 9:30 Pacific time kind of end time here. Are we okay to go a couple minutes long here? Because there are some great questions.
So.
Cool. There are some great questions that I want to get to. And many of these questions are kind of getting at the same thing. So I'm going to try to approach these within these themes. And again, forgive me if I don't get to your specific question. We will be sure to follow up with you afterwards. So to start, I'm getting a lot of questions on, do I require certification? Do my suppliers require certification? Maybe I'm a box in, box out operation that I purchase product, it is stored at my warehouse, and then it is sold to my customers, but I don't touch it. Or maybe I facilitate the trade of product from a supplier to a buyer. Or maybe I just warehouse these products. So the bottom line, if you're buying, selling organic product that is not packaged and labeled for retail sale, buying, selling, facilitating transactions of non-retail product, again, this is product that is not labeled for retail sale, that requires certification. Even if you are box in, box out, even if this product is sealed in tamper evident packaging, unless it is labeled for retail sale, you're box in, box out, you're only buying and selling, yes, that does require certification. I'm also seeing a number of questions about importing of organic products. Importing of organic products alone requires certification, as does exporting. All of these transactions need to be covered by an NOP transaction certificate, or otherwise known as an NOP import certificate. It's the responsibility of the offshore exporter that is sending that product to the United States to have their certifier issue an NOP import certificate. And then on the receiving end, it's your responsibility to make sure that what you received is covered by that import certificate, that you're not taking delivery of a greater volume than what has been granted on that import certificate. So again, if you're importing or exporting, even if that's just retail product, yes, that requires certification. If you're box in, box out, and that's non-retail product, that requires certification. If you're a broker or a trader of non-retail product, maybe you don't even take physical possession of it, but it's a non-retail product, yes, that requires certification. So I'm trying to kind of address many of the questions that we're getting that are in that theme, kind of all in one response here. And if you have specific detailed questions about your own operations activities, drop those in the chat. We'll make sure to follow up and get you an answer to your question. I am getting some other questions about how to develop the fraud prevention plan itself. What kind of critical control points might there be? I'm an operation that is only buying, storing, and distributing sealed non-retail product. What critical control points could there possibly be? Well, one, you might be provided a fraudulent organic certificate. That happens more often than we would like to see, right? There are bad actors out there. So a critical control point could be your supplier verification program. How well do you know these suppliers? Do you have a system in place to verify, is your supplier certified? Is the product that you receive from that certified supplier itself covered under their certification, right? There's a number of areas that are higher risk than others. You think about products that can be easily blended, grains and oil seeds, for example. There is a long history of organic fraud, and maybe a supplier will have a certain quantity of organic product on hand, but the demand is greater than what they can source. We've seen cases where that organic product is blended with non-organic product and passed off as organic. So how can you mitigate that risk? Well, you can verify what you've received relative to that NOP import certificate. We as certifiers, we often will verify with the certifying agent, other certifying agents, our counterparts within the industry, whether their customer is even capable of supplying that volume of product. And believe it or not, in the last month, we're only a month into this, mind you, we have already identified organic fraud. We verified with a supplier of one of our clients as to whether they had adequate quantity of that organic product on hand to fill this order. And the outcome was no, they didn't, right? So even if you're just importing, even if you're only sourcing from certified suppliers, there are critical control points there, and there are effective mitigation steps that you can take to verify the organic status of that product. So really...
Yeah, I think on that, Brandon, I think it's changing the mindset, right? I think a lot of us on this call think food safety, oh, it's closed. It's, I'm not doing anything with it. I'm just moving it, right? Not looking at it from the standpoint of, no, what we're really focused on is that, to your point, that organic risk. Box closed, open, bulk, right? Those are all the things that the NLP is asking us to do, which is look at all the supply chain, make sure you have transparency, make sure you have the certificates, verify those certificates. Yeah. So there are CCPs, right? They're not food safety, they're food fraud risk specific to organic. And so we just have to kind of just train our brain when we're doing this a little differently so we get this right.
Think like a criminal. Don't be a criminal, but think like a criminal. How could this potentially happen, right? I have a question here. How complex would a fraud prevention plan be for an importer or a brand owner? Maybe not quite as complex as it would be for a processor, especially if you're box in, box out, but there still are critical control points there. If your supplier has been motivated to commit fraud, if they're motivated and they're committed and there's a lot of money on the line here, they're going to try to work up these pretty sophisticated schemes that maybe at face value everything looks good, but when you start digging, when you start checking with the certifier of your supplier, or if you suspect that something might be up but you're not quite sure, call us, right? Call your certifier and we will help you navigate that, and we can help you get in touch with the certifier of your supplier, or we can do that personally. Refer concerns to us so that we can investigate them, right? It's in your best interest to do so.
Brandon, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, sounds good. Let's see. Is it mandatory to have a supply chain map in place? It's not written specifically in the regulations, thou shalt have a map of your supply chain. But as Denise covered, it's going to be really hard to really identify these critical control points within your supply chain unless you've done some diagramming and really can start to visually and conceptually understand these vectors for organic fraud.
Same with pre-screen. It's not required to do the pre-screen, but how are you going to really get the information that you need unless you pre-screen those ingredients, those suppliers, and then overlay that with the supply chain mapping exercise? Ultimately, then you're able to effectively conduct that vulnerability assessment, identify the CCPs, and then develop mitigation and monitoring activities to prevent organic fraud.
That's right. Exactly right. There are dozens and dozens more questions. I'm sorry that we don't have more time during the live session today. There are so many great questions in here, but rest assured, and keep them coming, we will give you a response. We'll follow up with you via email to make sure that all of your questions here are answered. So you can contact your SCS representatives for more information here. For USDA organic certification, that would be Ned Hallaby. For food safety training and consulting audits, Bernadette Goldstein and Nas Chaudhry. Here's their contact information. Give them a call, send them an email. They'll help you get started on the certification process. And, if you have questions and need more information, they'll make sure that your questions land in the hands of the personnel, the technical staff that can best address those questions. So Thank you all so very much for attending today. We really appreciate it. We hope that you can take this home with you. We hope that you can really feel like you're more prepared to develop and operationalize your organic fraud prevention plan. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week, and visit the SCS website, follow our newsletter. There's going to be many, many more webinars on these topics related to organic certification, technical topics, as well as a range of informative webinars for all of the services that we offer. So check in regularly, subscribe, to our emails, and we will be happy to help you forge your path ahead through any of your certification needs. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.